So we've introduced the concept of the material graph and how you build materials in it, but now we need to talk about all these types of nodes and how and when to use them. But before we even get into the nodes, I do want to talk about procedural textures because they differ greatly from image-based textures. There's a lot of benefits to using procedural textures, and one of our node types only shows us procedural textures here. So let's close out the material graph for a second. I want to isolate this top surface. So I'm going to hold Alt and left click on this, hide everything else. And make sure that we're working just on this top surface. I'll double click on it. Make sure I unlink the material. Make sure I'm working on just that material. And now when I go to my textures tab and we look at the texture we have on the surface, it is set to box mapping. Earlier, we talked about mapping types and the kind of drawbacks of some of these mapping types and some of the pros of others. Now, whenever we have to deal with mapping, it's usually a side effect of a image-based texture or a 2D texture. So what do I mean by that? When I hover over this diffuse texture in our library, we see it's a 1200 by 1200 pixel JPEG. So it's a flat image, only in the X and Y axis does it have any dimension. And therefore it becomes a challenge to get it to wrap correctly over the surface. Now procedural textures, at least the 3D type, don't have the same issue. Another issue that we have with image-based textures is resolution. Now in this case, when we zoom in, it's actually doing a pretty good job of blurring, but this is only a 1200 by 1200 pixel image. So what that means is its resolution is fairly low. And if we zoom out a little bit, it looks blurry or pixelated. And that's because it just doesn't have enough resolution. Now, if this was something like a 4000 pixel or an 8000 pixel image texture, it would look a lot more detailed and perhaps a lot more realistic. This is another thing we don't have to worry about with procedural textures. They have an unlimited amount of resolution. In fact, they're almost like working in vector data instead of raster data like these images here. So if these procedural textures are so great, why don't we just use them all the time instead of these image-based textures? Well, there are some downsides to procedural textures, and most often when you're trying to go for a more organic texture like wood, which is made by nature, you're better off using an image-based texture because it is a photograph of a real thing and it is more organic than a computer is able to easily generate. But when we want something that's a repeating pattern or a man-made or a synthetic pattern, we can use procedural textures to produce this result. So enough talk about them, let's actually use them. In our material graph, when we right-click and go down to textures, we see a big long list. We have a few types of mapping. Then we have a line separating it from these three: brush, mesh, and weave. These three are two-dimensional procedural textures. So they're procedural, and that comes with the benefit of having an unlimited resolution and a high level of customization, but they're still two-dimensional, which means they still have to rely on mapping types to get them to lay properly, either UV mapping or one of the other standard types. Everything down below this next line is a three-dimensional procedural texture. A 3D procedural texture is not like wrapping a box in paper that looks like wood. In fact, it's like making a box out of wood. And that if you were to cut it in half, you would actually, if you were to cut a piece of wood in half, you would see the grain and the texture going right through it. So we have a wood texture, which will produce this kind of effect with an end grain and everything. We have a marble texture. So regardless of what shape your model is, it will look like it's carved out of marble. We have a granite, we have camouflage, and we have a number of others that don't necessarily represent real materials, but are quite useful. So let's start with a very basic example, and I'm going to choose something called camouflage. Now when I grab this camouflage texture, if I want to see what it looks like on my model before I even connect it to anything, all I have to do is either right click and go down to preview color, or we see the shortcut is C on the keyboard, C as in Charlie. So I click on that and I hit C, and now we see the camouflage texture on our part. Every other node becomes hashed out because it's ignoring that, and we're only working on this one here. So we can actually make some changes to the settings of this texture before we connect it, which is quite useful. So what we're doing here is we're looking at the color data. It's ignoring things like shadows and highlights and material properties and just focusing on the color texture data here. Now we can actually go and customize this far more than we could just a image-based texture. For example, an image-based texture would not allow us to take the distortion of this pattern and play with the shape of it. An image is actually like locked in place. Those pixels can only be changed as far as like color goes and brightness, but this you can actually change the shape and the actual design of the texture. We can play with color balance and distribute the colors differently. In fact, we can go and customize the colors altogether. And this is where you start to see the power of a procedural texture. In this case, I can have something like a party texture. We can also go down under distortion and variation and do further customization. So if I want to take the spray, I can soften the edges, which is like blurred. And then I can say mix colors and it'll find tertiary colors in between. You could not do any of this level of customization with a plain old image-based texture, okay? I know I'm really hammering this home, I think, but I just want to make sure this is very clear and understood. Now that we've done this, if I hit C to escape that preview, we don't see any change to our model because we haven't connected this node. So if I connect this node into our diffuse, now we have our table that has this camouflage on top of it. I'm going to take the spray all the way down so we can zoom in. And another point I want to make is that these edges, you'll see are very sharp. They don't blur at all, no matter how close you get. This will never pixelate. Because again, this is being generated in Keyshot in real time using some code. That's basically what a procedural texture is. And they're all built on some sort of pattern, more or less. You know, there's another one we can grab just to make that point. If I grab something like the marble procedural texture and I plug that into diffuse, now you see we have a marble. It looks like a marble countertop. Of course, if we double click on the marble, we could change its color. Maybe we want it more blue instead of red. And perhaps it's a little bit small, so we could scale it up. And if we want, we can move it. And this is what's really cool. As we move it, you'll notice the mapping is changing. So now we can have the grain going horizontal across the top of the marble. And if I want to play with it, I can take the vein noise and noise scale, and I can play with those settings to make it more random. Or I can actually reduce all that. And now we just have some parallel lines. So the marble is a procedural texture built off of the underlying math of parallel lines. That's all it is. And while I've been using these procedural textures plugged into the diffuse channel just to make it easier to see the effect, they don't only have to be plugged into diffuse. So I'm actually going to disconnect this, set the diffuse color to black, and this should be a pretty good example. If I right click and go to textures, grab the noise texture, and plug this into the bump channel, you can see that we actually get ripples on the surface. Let's go in here and play with the bump height a little bit. So as we increase it, we get more and more strong bump effect. Now, if we hit C to preview this, we can see the actual color of this texture. And it's just this kind of splotchy white and gray, almost looks like static or clouds. And again, remember, I mentioned procedural textures not having any trouble when it comes to mapping. Any of these textures below the second line are three-dimensional textures, which means they project through this entire volume instead of just being on the surface. The benefit of that is we get the texture mapping over the surface no matter how complex it is. So by hitting C to get out of preview, we can see the effect of this bump texture again, and it looks like a orange peel sort of texture finish that you get on some sort of car paints. We can reduce the bump height or even go negative with the value to invert it. Again, these procedural textures are highly customizable. We can change the way they look by using any of the properties associated with them. So with the many benefits of procedural textures, whenever you can, it's a pretty good idea to try and use them. If you don't have good image-based textures, procedural textures usually will work. Now you do have to get creative and know how to customize them to really make them look as realistic as possible. And that just comes with practice. I have a lot of tutorials on my YouTube channel from a series called Material Graph Monday, where I would create step-by-step various materials using the material graph. And there's a lot of tips and tricks you can pick up there that I couldn't possibly cover in this course here. But yeah, I just wanted to get you introduced to the idea or the concept of procedural textures and how they differ from image-based textures. So to recap, image-based textures have a finite resolution. You need to get clever and find a way to map them onto your part properly. They also take up space. We didn't even talk about this, but from a performance standpoint, if you have a lot of large high-res textures in your keyshot scene, it can start to slow things down, both in real time and rendering speeds. Procedural textures are generated in keyshot in real time. They're very lightweight, and you can use them in any way you see fit commercially. So they're very useful and flexible and highly customizable. Last but not least, if you send somebody a keyshot file, you need to send them a keyshot package if you're using any image-based textures that aren't in the keyshot library. That way Keyshot will find all these assets, bundle them up, and save them together. Whereas procedurals are built into Keyshot. So you could send someone a Keyshot BIP file, a BIP, as long as you only used built-in procedurals, and they would have access to all those materials and textures as well. All right. In the next video, I'm going to run through pretty much all these procedural textures and what you use them for.